So you mean to tell me that once upon a time there was an actual Leatherface walking around the state of Texas? Well, the short answer to that is no. Not really. At least not in the way that you might think. Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise is loosely, and I do mean very, very loosely, based on real life serial killer Ed Gein. When I say loosely based, I mean they literally took one disturbing fact from Ed Gein's life and said, "Ooh, spooky," and built an entire legacy out of it. But, you know, I'm not bad. I do love horror. So today we're talking about one of his most iconic chainsaw wielding, skin mask wearing legends, Leatherface. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise kicked off in 1974 and it was directed by Tobe Hooper. And it basically traumatized an entire generation, okay? The plot? Classic horror setup. A group of young adults take a road trip, make some questionable stops, and just so happen to stumble across a family of rural, cannibalistic psychos. You know, just a regular Tuesday in horror movie logic. And then enters our boy, Leatherface. A towering man in a butcher's apron wearing a mask made of human skin, chasing people with a chainsaw, grunting like a wild animal and just doing absolutely nothing nice whatsoever. You know, it was gritty, it was gross, and it was based on a true story, which, spoiler alert, is just a marketing stretch, a huge one at that. But it did work. The film became a cult classic, spawned sequels, reboots, prequels, and remakes, and it cemented Leatherface as one of horror's most terrifying slasher villains. In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, Leatherface's identity varies across different timelines, primarily as Bubba Sawyer and Thomas Hewitt. Bubba Sawyer was introduced in the original 1974 film and its sequels. Bubba is part of the Sawyer family, a clan of cannibalistic grave robbers. Bubba is portrayed as mentally challenged, nonverbal, and heavily influenced by his family. His use of different masks represents various personas he has, such as the old lady, the pretty woman, things like that, indicating his emotional states and roles within the family. And his actions are driven by obedience and fear rather than pure malice, making him a tragic figure manipulated by his relatives. Thomas Hewitt was introduced in the 2003 remake and his 2006 prequel. Thomas is part of the Hewitt family, a reimagined version of the Sawyers. Thomas, born with a skin disease causing facial deformities, was abandoned and later adopted by the Hewitts. He works in a slaughterhouse, and after being fired, that's when his killing spree begins. Thomas is more aggressive and less sympathetic than Bubba. His actions are portrayed as a response to societal rejection and personal trauma. While both characters are influenced by their families, Bubba's actions stem from manipulation, whereas Thomas are portrayed as reactions to external abuse and internal turmoil. Bubba exhibits childlike obedience, while Thomas displays calculated aggression. Bubba serves as a pawn in his family, whereas Thomas is a central figure driving the terror. The 1974 original 2003 remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre offer distinct interpretations of horror, reflecting the eras that they came from. The 1974 original uses a documentary type approach with grainy visuals, creating a sense of realism and unease. And it also relied heavily on violence and psychological horror, just allowing viewers to imagine the fear and make it worse. It also explores a breakdown of the American family and critiques societal norms. It also pioneered the slasher genre, influencing countless horror films. The 2003 remake features high-definition visuals and a polished aesthetic, aligning with the modern horror trends we have now. And the violence was more gore, explicit gore, and intense action sequences. And it also focused on survival and the brutality of Leatherface, with less emphasis on societal thing going on. And also revitalized interest in the franchise in the first place, leading to additional sequels and prequels that we probably didn't need. So the original subtle horror contrasts with the remake's visceral intensity that it had. In the 1974 film centers on atmospheric dread, while the 2003 version prioritized action and shock value, the gore. Each film mirrors the societal fears of its time, the original reflecting post-Vietnam disillusionment and the remake echoing early 2000s anxieties. While Leatherface is a fictional character, his creation was influenced by real-life murderer Ed Gein, whose crimes shocked the nations in the 1950s. Ed Gein was a reclusive man from Plainfield, Wisconsin. Gein was known for his obsession with his deceased mother and his interest in human anatomy. So, Gein exhumed corpses from local graveyards and fashioned trophies and keepsakes from their bones and skin. He also confessed to murdering 2 women, actually. And authorities found like human remains in his home, including skulls used as bowls and a suit made of skin. And there was like a lamp made of skin. It's gross. So Gein's creation of masks from human skin directly inspired Leatherface's signature look. Okay, both figures exhibit a disturbed relationship with their mothers, and a compulsion to assume different identities. Gein's crimes influenced not only the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but also other horror films like Psycho and The Silence of the Lambs. So we've talked about the timeline as a real-life inspiration and the mess of reboots. Let's actually pause and ask, who is Leatherface beneath the mask? What is his actual backstory? Well, it really just depends on which timeline you're in. So let's just look at both and take a deeper look. So the original film, Bubba Sawyer's timeline, Leatherface is never given a clear backstory in the 1974 film, and that was intentional. Director Tobe Hooper wanted the horror to feel like random, senseless, and just raw. You don't know why he kills. You don't know who taught him how to use a chainsaw. You don't even really know his name. By the time we get to Chainsaw Massacre 2, we do learn more. His name is Bubba Sawyer. He's one of several brothers, including Chop Top and Drayton Sawyer, who helps him run a bizarre underground chili business. Yes, I know, weird. He is treated like a mentally disabled child, like often yelled at and controlled by his family. He wears different skin masks to express different roles. Weird. Some versions suggest that he doesn't have a full identity of his own, so he becomes others through their faces. By Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation, things get weird. Okay, Leatherface is shown in makeup and a dress, hinting at possible gender confusion or like identity dysphoria. Though this portrayal is highly debated and often criticized for being exploitative rather than thoughtful. There are also some like comic books and like unproduced scripts that suggest Bubba was abused as a child and raised in isolation and was taught to kill as a means of survival. In one comic, even suggests he was the youngest in the family and just never learned to speak properly. So in this version, Leatherface is a tool, an enforcer, a tragic figure created and shaped by his environment. So Thomas Hewitt gets a full-blown origin story in the 2003 remake and its prequel, The Beginning. Born in 1939 with a rare skin disease, we don't know what, Thomas was abandoned in a dumpster behind a meatpacking plant and later adopted by the Hewitt family. He was raised in an abusive household. He grew up working in a slaughterhouse, and when it was shut down, he just snapped and murdered his boss with a sledgehammer. And then he continued killing trespassers and outsiders under the guidance of his adoptive uncle, Sheriff Hoyt, who really isn't a real sheriff. He's just a psychopath in a uniform. And then he becomes Leatherface. Well, this version of Leatherface is more like rage driven. He's still nonverbal, still brutal, but we see like clear emotional pain, especially like around his face. When his nose starts deteriorating from infection, he cuts off what's left and begins wearing masks to hide his deformity, not to express his identity. And here's a deeper detail a lot of people miss. In the 2006 prequel, there's a scene where Thomas kills a man with a chainsaw and then takes his face. That's the first time he wears a mask made from another person, and it marks the true birth of Leatherface in this timeline. So in this version, Leatherface is a monster made by trauma, social rejection, physical pain, and emotional abandonment. So, who is Leatherface? Well, he's a childlike manipulated pawn. He's a disfigured, rage-filled outcast, a man with no voice, and literally and figuratively, a man who only becomes someone by wearing another person's face. And that right there, that's what makes him so terrifying. He's not some evil mastermind. He's a product of circumstance, his environment, a mirror of cruelty. And no matter which version you prefer, both Leatherfaces are proof that the scariest villains are often the ones who were made, not born. So no, Leatherface was never real, but the horror that inspired him was, and the stories we've told about him over decades and 9 movies show how deeply he's carved himself into our pop culture. Whether you call him Bubba Sawyer, Thomas Hewitt, or just the scary chainsaw guy, Leatherface is a horror icon, one that reflects trauma, identity, the darkness that comes from being raised in such chaos. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button, subscribe for more horror breakdowns, and let me know in the comments, which version of Leatherface do you think is more terrifying? Thomas Hewitt. But until next time, keep your lights on and maybe just don't go driving around in Texas back roads.